One of the things that I want to talk about in terms of engine airflow estimation is a throttle body model. Let me load a data log here. Alright, there we go. So let's go over to the TB throttle body flow model page. So what I have here is basically a graph where on the x-axis is TPS and on the y-axis is an index that I call a throttle body equivalent diameter. Now what that is, if you assume or if you imagine that you replace the throttle body with a variable orifice, and that orifice has a perfect discharge coefficient of 1, basically back calculating, what would that equivalent diameter be as a function of throttle position. So let me wiggle this so it updates here. Alright, there we go. So the red dots are back calculated equivalent diameters based on airflow as estimated by AFR times fuel within this AFR range. So you can see that there's a pretty decent correlation there, fairly linear up to a certain point in terms of equivalent diameter versus TPS. Now if you use equivalent area, it will have a different shape to the curve, but equivalent diameter is sort of nice because of the fact that it has a squared relationship with the diameter, so that the result being it's actually fairly linear. So that's the reason why I'm using an equivalent diameter instead of an effective area, as it were, so that you have the nicer linearity here. And if you have a throttle body that doesn't have a profile machined to the inside, if it's cylindrical, then it's actually amazingly linear through here, up to the point where you hit the point of diminishing returns, and the system doesn't flow quite as much more once you get to a certain throttle position. But anyway, what this allows you to do is it allows you to basically set a curve, a calibration curve, for the equivalent diameter, based on the back calculated readings, which are the red dots here. So you can also filter it based on the pressure ratio. So the lower the pressure ratio across the throttle body, the more trustworthy the curve would be. So like if you're below, say a roughly 0.5 pressure ratio, that means the flow is choked. Really the throttle body model doesn't even care about what the engine is doing. I mean, it could be a 305 small block Chevy, or it could be a rare Morrison engine or something. It doesn't really care if the manifold pressure is low enough so that the flow is choked, or the throttle body pressure ratio is low enough. Then that's the nice part about using a throttle body model, is it really doesn't care what's going on with the engine. And in the context of VVT, that's nice because the cams can be in any kind of crazy place, and the throttle body model doesn't care. So again, if you look at the response at the lower pressure ratios, or if you filter out the lower pressure ratios, you get a very good correlation there in terms of equivalent diameter versus TPS. If you go up in the pressure ratios, obviously as you approach 1-to-1, then you've got some noise, some inherent measurement noise that will limit the accuracy of your model. But let's just say keeping below say 95% threshold, something like that. So you can see that there's a decent correlation here. There's a little bit of spread, and for that reason I added in what I call a pressure factor, which accounts for a tiny bit of slope difference between ideal versus non-ideal. So if I wiggle this so it will refresh, then you see it actually collapses down remarkably well. So through this region, it's you've got very good overlay between what I call my calibration data here, my curve, and if you move one of these, you can see. So if this were my curve, that's moving further and further away from the actual measured data, but there's good correlation there. And there's also a filter, like if you have very noisy data, or if you have some outliers, I should say. What this does is it specifies the number of standard deviations that it will accept the data. So beyond a certain point, like it will throw out if the standard deviation within the segment is greater than this number that I'm moving with the slider here. You can see that it's selecting closer and closer to the mean. So that's one standard deviation. So that's way too tight. But you can see that basically in the area where there's good correlation, it's thrown out all of the outliers. But I'll just increase that so you can see the outliers as well. And you have the option of you can copy the entire. Well, let me back up and say, so the blue dots are actually a fit that the program is recommending based on the spread of the data, the red points. So it's actually so close through here it's hard to see the blue points, but here you can see that here's a blue point, here's a blue point. And because of the fact the data is sparse, the fit isn't very nice in terms of it's oscillating a little bit there because of the sparseness of the data. But you have the option. So this is the one that I changed. You have the option of copying the fit point by point. So if I click this button, what that will do is, and let me wiggle this so it refreshes, then that copies the what was the blue point, which was here, into the to the equivalent diameter calibration point, as it were. And you can do the entire curve at once if you wanted to do that. You could hit copy fit to the curve, and then you can see that it goes through all of the individual blue points. But normally I just do them one by one, and you have the option. Okay, so I should have said at the beginning, this is using the airflow as estimated by the AFR times the fuel to back calculate the throttle body equivalent diameter. You can also shift over and use the mass flow sensor as a reference. If you want to do that, you can see the effect of shifting back and forth. Because of the fact that the mass flow sensor is calibrated well, you barely see it move, which is a good thing. And if you're using the AFR times fuel as your airflow reference, then you can specify a range, between which you consider it valid. Like you'd want to throw out the really rich and really lean points where the O2 sensor may or may not be reading well, or where it may be in a transient for that matter. Most of this data is fairly steady state, so there are minimal transients here. Anyway, one more thing that you can do that I find helpful is, in addition to looking at the calibration data, the white line, and the back calculated data, the measured points, the red dots, sometimes that because of the scale over which they change, they're a little bit difficult to see visually. So there's a ratio graph here, which is basically the ratio of the red dot placement versus the white calibration line. So let's just say, let's screw one of these things up intentionally. So if you overestimate the equivalent diameter and the calibration data, what this does is it shows the ratio that you're off by. So ideally you want it to be hovering right around the midline here at 1. And if you're deviating from that, if you see that this is deviating, then that's obviously a dead giveaway that you need to readjust it. I'll copy that back, and then let's see, refresh it here. But you can see, so the difference between there's some subtle differences when you switch between the air fuel and then the mass flow model for the airflow estimation. You can see it more clearly on the ratio graph, and you can choose to hide it or turn it on. And in the same way, you can spot outliers here, and pull the outliers from your general data set. So if they stand out as outliers in this particular graph, then maybe it's because of a transient, maybe it's because of mismeasurement. Who knows? But you can use this as a criterion to reject ill-fitting data. But anyway, that's the basics of the interface for the throttle body flow model. Basically equivalent diameter versus TPS. I found to be a decent way to estimate an airflow independent of any other engine parameters. So that's another possibility to use for airflow estimation.